We now have time for some questions, and before we do that, I know that Dusko wanted to say a few words about the International Human Microbiome Standards Working Group.
I was advised that the funding agencies asked for a kind of summary of IHMS. Actually, Patrick did show a slide which summarized International Human Microbiome Standards project. It is a project which aims for coordination. It is funded at the level of 2 million euros, involves institutions from Europe, Canada, United States, and China. The representative from United States, HMP project, is Baylor College, and the idea is that the Baylor College kind of interfaces MetaHit and MetaHit related activities with other centers in HMP. In China, it's BGI and Shanghai University. And in Europe, the major players are 4 institutions, INRA for coordination, and these outreach activities which aim to connect not only the partners of the program, but also reach out first to the HMP guys and other institutions which are included into IHMC, the consortium, and beyond that, to other institutions who run large programs where we think standardization is needed. Second, INRA is also responsible for standardization of protocols for sample collection, sample handling, and what I call sample annotation, which is basically metadata around description of the sample. The scientist in charge of that is Joël Doré, whom all of you know, and who has reached about 20 institutions already for that, and got positive response from them in that. The second is trying to standardize sequence across sequencing procedures, sequencing ways, and the quality of the sequence. It really almost goes along the slide that Per projected when he said, you know, what are some of the key issues, and Genoscope is in charge of that. And the third is data analysis procedures, because we do know that for comparability of final data, it is very important that we know how to compare. The objective is not to ask everybody to use the same things, but at least to create the translators so that we can easily compare data from different studies. It is a 4-year project, and it has started this year, so it extends for 3 more years. I think it is a pilot kind of project. We feel very strongly the need, and that would be one area where perhaps, you know, I'd ask funders, since I'm trying to get into the question part and I'm holding the mic, so. Would you guys find it useful to reinforce that sort of activity? You were talking about you know, different aspects of what you kind of plan to fund without being able to tell us everything, but we'll ask you a little more. But I'm starting asking about this sort of coordination activity. Would you fund an extension, reinforcements of that?
Excellent, very direct question there. Lita, do you want to go?
I think, well, I'm not in a position to recommend funding, but I'm in a position to discuss it with the Common Fund, and certainly they're already interested, the Common Fund's already interested in this idea of leveraging the massive data set we've already produced and making sure they are comparable, and making sure the metadata, and making sure that, you know, all the things really help us get more out of the data than just each project. So I think we're quite interested. You know, and we just now started this conversation, so we'll see where that goes. But I would be happy to recommend that we find some way to partner on doing this kind of comparison. And I think actually Owen either has a comment or a question.
Yes, question over there.
If standards were developed, do the different people that are up at the podium, could you comment on, do you have a mechanism to enforce the use of standards? Do you have a mechanism that you could make a condition of giving funding include adhering to standards? Because at this point, there is no such mechanism.
At CIHR, we don't have the means to be able to do this, but you know, on the first day, there was a question about somebody in the audience talking about smaller labs doing microbiome research, and if there's common standards that are being used with you know, a common set of doing things, I think this will allow smaller organizations or smaller labs to be able to dig into the massive amount of data that is available and come to hypothesis and experimental procedures. So we see a lot of virtue in having some standardized way of doing microbiome. We understand that this is, you know, and it's great actually that IHMS started that soon in the microbiome area.
Yes, I don't have much more to add. This is certainly an issue for each of these large-scale consortia that I had on one slide. And normally it's, I think, something that has to be agreed on the level of this international consortia. It's normally something that is put on the white paper or a strategy paper, and then each of the participating funders, let's say, in a soft way enforces it. How do we at the Commission enforce it simply? Well, not speaking about microbiome, but for example, how did we do it in case of cancer genomics, where there exists such a document on the consortium level. We simply put it into the annual call, into the topic, the text, that the data samples have to be gathered and data analyzed and so on according to the principle of this consortium, and then the people can go there and take a look and comply with it, and this is one of the evaluation criteria then.
That's very helpful. If that could be applied across all the funding agencies, that would be significant progress.
A question in the middle.
Yeah, just to comment on that, actually, to finish, there are conditions where, or situations where, when we publish on clinical trials, we have to deposit the description of the trial itself, and so the international community has been able to do that, so we should be able to do that. I had one question. What we see in the expansion of knowledge at the moment in capturing diversity in metagenomes worldwide is actually not worldwide. It's the Western world and the developed countries and China a lot, but it's excluding Russia and Africa and South America and India. So I wanted to know whether you had in mind some ways to help us expand and cover the world, basically.
Right, excellent question about expanding the diversity of our data sets. Who would like to take that? I'm going to pick names soon.
Well, I don't know that we're directly addressing that, but there's no restriction, you know, if there were a cohort study, if we supported cohorts and there were a cohort study with a non-Western population that met the call of the RFAs, and of course they'd be welcome to apply. But no, we're not, as far as I know, at this point in our planning, we haven't talked specifically about reaching out to non-Western populations in the context of HMP2. And obviously, with that kind of comment, probably we should try to pay attention to it, but we're not doing anything explicitly.
I noted that there were some posters trying to look at doing this type of work with Amazonian populations. Is the person behind that around? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Could you say anything about those efforts?
Those efforts? Just that right now we have a pretty elaborate IRB process to go through, but we do have samples. And some previous studies have shown that there does appear to be some differences in these more rural traditional populations compared to a more cosmopolitan population. But it's really too early to go into any other details than that. I would say that it is a concern that maybe we're recreating the same ascertainment bias that the Human Genome Project had when lot of our data about disease association was restricted to a few ethnic groups. So it is possible. It is possible that we actually have some of similar issues with ascertainment bias and understanding microbiome diversity, and maybe that could be an incentive for having a bit more momentum, including some of these more remote communities or communities in developing countries. That may actually be a good reason to do that. Of course, I am biased since I am doing that type of work, but it does sort of have an analogy with the Human Genome Project, where we saw that. I mean, we saw with HapMap and these other projects how important it became to include global diversity.
Ed, I was going to make a comment. The other kind of funder that's not at the table is private funders. And so I understand the Gates Foundation, for example, has some cohort studies focused on the microbiome, but they're focusing in African countries and in Southeast Asian countries. And I don't know if I have this wrong, but I got the impression that Wellcome Trust was also doing some cohort studies in non-Western countries. So there are non-Western cohort studies being done on the microbiome, but it's not being done in the context of HMP.
Thank you. So we've got time for two more questions. First, gentleman over there, and then over there.
There's been just a fantastic amount of research discussed in the last few days on the last 5 years, which I guess I would characterize mainly as looking at the what and the who. The question that keeps coming up throughout a lot of these presentations is one of cause and effect. And so the next step might be thought of as, okay, now that we have this information on who's there, now what do we do about it in terms of therapeutic or health improving therapies or lifestyles? Do you see much work in the next several years taking that next step in terms of intervention strategies based on the microbiome and how that can then translate into human health?
Absolutely, and I hope this is the goal. First is the generation of the knowledge, and then it's attempts to translate that knowledge into health strategies. And I think there's a realization right now of many different fields of health research, and also our environmental fellows that have contributed a lot at the beginning on the human microbiome research about the wide range implications of microbiome. And I think in the last few days, I mean, this was a fantastic demonstration of this, that now indeed it's going into the translation of that knowledge, the application of that knowledge, and I think as a funder, this is something that it will be of great interest.
Exactly the same, the same comment. When I spoke to some people, I personally didn't attend the first two congresses. I mean, I didn't listen to all the scientific discussion. But then, when I spoke to some people, I said, "How do you compare what is being discussed here today with what has been discussed a year ago or 2 years ago?" And the answer was that it's more and more moving towards application. So, from data gathering to understanding and the use of data for clinics.
Actually, I want to make a comment because, even though I'm here to represent HMP, I want to point out that not all the human microbiome research at NIH is happening through HMP. There are certainly IC-specific activities, and, they're not being represented here at the table, but there are a lot of programs, and some of the ones are addressing, for example, the use of probiotics. So there's the office is called NCAM, I think it's called National Complementary and Alternative Medicine Center. ODS was Office of Dietary Supplements, and NCI, I learned the other day that they have a program on looking at anti-inflammatory agents for treating precancerous conditions. So across the NIH, it's my impression there's terrific interest and growth in more applied aspects of the human microbiome area.
Okay, and we have time for one quick final question.
Yeah, I want to come back to the point about sampling around the world, because one is an issue of equity and also scientific comprehensiveness. But there's another issue, and that's a kind of race against the clock, because the world is changing very rapidly, and modern lifestyles are moving into everywhere. And the question is, if the microbiome is changing, we need to be able to archive and understand peoples who have been less affected by modern life, so that we understand the ancestral structure and possibly have a reservoir of organisms to use for replacement.
Great. I think that's a fantastic point to finish off with this first round.